A Stranger's Eyes.
France, 1918.
Isabel Hartley had carried Lieutenant Samuel Hayes' lucky coin since the day he was reported missing. But one morning, she reached into her pocket and found a second one identical, down to the scratch across the surface. And on the edge, newly etched, "I'm coming back." Chapter 1. The Weight of Absence. The chill of the pre-dawn air seeped through the thin fabric of Isabel Hartley's nurse's uniform, raising gooseflesh on her arms. Another day, another wave of wounded soldiers arriving at the makeshift hospital in Amiens. The once grand cathedral now echoed with the moans of the injured and the hurried whispers of medical staff, a symphony of suffering that had become the soundtrack of Isabel's life. She adjusted the starched white cap perched atop her dark, braided hair, the fabric a stark contrast to the perpetual grime that seemed to cling to everything in this war-torn world. Her fingers, chapped and raw from endless scrubbing with harsh carbolic soap, brushed against the smooth, cold metal in her pocket. The coin. Lieutenant Samuel Hayes' lucky coin. She'd carried it every day since he was reported missing in action 6 months ago, a tangible link to a man who had become more than just a patient, more than just a friend. A foolish hope, perhaps, but it was all she had left. Samuel. The memory of his smile, the way his eyes, the color of warm honey, crinkled at the corners when he laughed, threatened to bring a fresh wave of tears. She blinked them back fiercely. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here, not now. There were men who needed her, men whose lives depended on her steady hands and unwavering focus. The hospital was a converted cathedral, its stained glass windows long since shattered, replaced with patched-up canvas that billowed in the wind. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, mingled with the metallic tang of blood and the ever-present odor of mud and decay that clung to the soldiers like a shroud. Isabel moved through the rows of cots, her footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. Each face was a story of pain, of loss, of shattered dreams. Young men, barely more than boys, their bodies ravaged by the horrors of the trenches. She paused beside a young soldier, his face pale and drawn, his legs swathed in blood-soaked bandages. Private Thomas Baker. He'd arrived yesterday, a victim of a shell explosion. Isabel gently checked his pulse, her fingers lingering on his wrist. Weak, but steady. He was one of the lucky ones. He would live. But what kind of life would he return to? A life with a missing limb, a life haunted by the nightmares of war. Isabel had seen too much death, too much suffering. It had hardened her, yes, but it had also deepened her compassion. She had learned to compartmentalize, to build walls around her heart, to protect herself from the overwhelming tide of grief that threatened to consume her. But Samuel, he had breached those walls. He had seen through her carefully constructed facade to the vulnerable woman beneath. He had been her patient, wounded in the shoulder during the fighting near Arras. He had spent weeks in her care, recovering from his injury. They had talked for hours, sharing stories, dreams, fears. He had told her about his childhood in the rolling hills of Devon, about his love of poetry, about his hopes for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. She had told him about her life before the war, about her dreams of becoming a doctor, dreams that had been put on hold when the world had gone mad. Their connection had been immediate, a spark of warmth in the cold, desolate landscape of war. A forbidden spark, of course. A nurse and a soldier. It was against the rules, against all common sense. But the heart, it seemed, had a will of its own. Their whispered conversations, their stolen glances across the crowded ward, the brush of their hands as she tended to his wounds, these were the moments that had sustained her, that had given her the strength to carry on. Then he had been sent back to the front. And then silence. The telegram had arrived, stark and impersonal. Lieutenant Samuel Hayes, missing in action, presumed dead. The words had struck her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless, numb. She had refused to believe it. She had to believe he was still alive, somewhere out there. She reached into her pocket again, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of the coin. He had given it to her the day he left, pressing it into her palm, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "It's my lucky charm," he had said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's seen me through some tough scrapes. Keep it safe for me, Isabel. Until I come back." A sudden surge of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through her grief. Anger at the war, at the senseless waste of life, at the cruel hand of fate that had snatched Samuel away from her. She clenched her fist around the coin, the metal digging into her palm. She wouldn't give up hope. She wouldn't let the darkness win. She would keep his memory alive, keep his spirit burning bright. Until what? Until she found him? Until she accepted the inevitable? The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. Dr. Dubois, the head surgeon, a gruff but kind man with tired eyes and a perpetually weary expression, was making his rounds. "Isabel," he said, his voice raspy, "we have another convoy arriving. Prepare yourself. It's going to be a long day." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the first hint of dawn was painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. A long day, and perhaps, somewhere out there, in the muddy trenches, in the heart of the darkness, Samuel was still fighting. She had to believe that. She had to. The coin felt heavy in her pocket, a weight both burdensome and comforting. A promise she wouldn't break. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the onslaught to come, the endless parade of broken bodies and shattered souls. She had a duty to fulfill, a promise to keep. And she wouldn't falter. Not now, not ever. The war had taken so much, but there were things she would never let it win. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Ward. The new convoy arrived with the rising sun, a grim procession of ambulances and trucks, their engines groaning under the weight of their human cargo. The cathedral quickly transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Orderlies rushed to unload the wounded, their faces grim, their movements efficient. The air filled with the cries of the injured, the sharp commands of the doctors, and the metallic clang of surgical instruments. Isabel moved through the throng, her senses heightened, her focus laser-sharp. She assessed injuries, applied tourniquets, administered morphine, her hands moving with a practiced grace that belied the turmoil churning within her. Each patient was a fleeting connection, a brief encounter in a sea of suffering. She offered a comforting word, a gentle touch, a fleeting moment of human connection in the midst of the impersonal machinery of war. One soldier, his face obscured by bandages, reached out and grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Nurse," he croaked, his voice raspy with pain. "Promise me you'll find him." Isabel's heart skipped a beat. Find who? She gently pried his fingers loose, her mind racing. Was he delirious? Had he somehow sensed her own desperate search? "Rest now," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to save your strength." She moved on, but the soldier's words lingered in her mind, a haunting echo of her own unspoken plea. The day wore on, a relentless cycle of blood and pain, of life and death. Isabel worked tirelessly, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion. She had learned to detach, to become a machine, a cog in the vast, impersonal engine of war. But the soldier's words, his desperate plea, had cracked her carefully constructed facade. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the cathedral floor, a lull descended upon the ward. The initial rush had subsided, leaving behind a weary silence, punctuated only by the occasional moan or whimper. Isabel leaned against a pillar, her body aching, her mind numb. She closed her eyes, seeking a moment of respite, a brief escape from the horrors that surrounded her. A soft melody drifted through the air, a familiar tune played on a battered harmonica. It was Private Baker, the young soldier with the amputated leg. He often played in the evenings, his music a poignant counterpoint to the grim reality of the ward. The tune was a folk song, a simple melody about love and loss, about longing and hope. It was a song Samuel had often hummed, a song that had become inextricably linked with his memory. Isabel felt a lump forming in her throat, the familiar ache of grief threatening to overwhelm her. She opened her eyes, her gaze drawn to the young soldier. He was sitting up in his cot, his face pale but composed, his eyes fixed on some distant point. He played with a quiet intensity, his music weaving a spell of bittersweet beauty. As the last notes faded away, a wave of applause rippled through the ward. Even the most hardened soldiers seemed to be moved by the simple melody. Private Baker smiled, a shy, hesitant smile. "My grandfather taught me that song," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He used to say it could soothe even the most troubled soul. Isabel found herself walking towards him, drawn by an invisible force. She sat down on the edge of his cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's a beautiful song," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers.
"It reminds me of home," he said.
Of a life before all this. Isabel understood. She, too, longed for a life before the war, a life where laughter came easily, where hope wasn't a fragile, fleeting thing. She longed for Samuel, for his warmth, his smile, his unwavering optimism. "Do you think we'll ever go back?" Private Baker asked, his voice filled with a vulnerability that mirrored her own. Isabel didn't have an answer. She didn't know what the future held for him, for her, for anyone. But she couldn't let him see her doubt. She had to be strong, for him, for all the others who depended on her. "We have to believe we will," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "We have to hold on to that hope. It's all we have left." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You seem to be holding on to something else, too," he said, his voice hesitant. "Something or someone." Isabel's hand instinctively went to her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the coin. She had almost forgotten about it, lost in the relentless demands of the day. But now, the weight of it felt heavier than ever. "It's just a memory," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze understanding. "Memories can be powerful things," he said. "They can give us strength, even when we think we have none left." He picked up his harmonica again, his fingers moving across the reeds. He began to play another song, a different melody, but one that still carried the same undercurrent of longing and hope. Isabel listened, her heart aching, her mind filled with images of Samuel. The music seemed to fill the void within her, a temporary balm for her wounded soul. The echoes of the ward, the whispers of the wounded, the cries of the dying, all faded into the background. For a few precious moments, she was transported to another place, another time, a time before the war, a time when she had believed in the possibility of happiness. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember glowing in the darkness. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let the war extinguish that flame. She would keep searching, keep hoping, keep believing. For Samuel, for herself, for the future. Chapter 3. The Second Coin. The exhaustion was bone deep, a leaden weight that settled in Isabel's limbs. Even after the ward had quieted, sleep eluded her. The faces of the wounded, the echoes of their cries, the persistent ache of Samuel's absence, it all swirled within her. A relentless torment. She tossed and turned in her narrow cot in the small room she shared with two other nurses, the thin mattress offering little comfort. Finally, just before dawn, she slipped out of bed, unable to bear the confines of the room any longer. She dressed quickly, her movements mechanical, her mind still clouded with fatigue. She needed air, space, a moment to gather herself before the new day's onslaught began. She stepped outside into the courtyard, the air crisp and cool against her skin. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hint of dawn painting the eastern horizon in shades of pale gray and rose. The cathedral loomed above her, its damaged facade a stark reminder of the war's destructive power. She walked towards a small, walled garden, a patch of green that had somehow survived the surrounding devastation. It was a place of refuge, a place where she often came to find a moment of peace. The flowers were mostly gone, replaced by weeds and overgrown shrubs, but there was a sense of serenity here, a quiet resilience that resonated with her own spirit. She sat down on a stone bench, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She reached into her pocket, her fingers automatically seeking the familiar comfort of Samuel's coin. She pulled it out, turning it over and over in her hand. The smooth, worn metal, the familiar inscription, the scratch across the surface, it was all so achingly familiar. And then she froze. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't Samuel's coin. Or rather, it was Samuel's coin, but different. She held it up to the faint light, her fingers trembling. It was identical in every way, the same size, the same weight, the same inscription, the same scratch. But there was something else. Something new. Along the edge of the coin, barely visible, were tiny, etched letters. She squinted, bringing the coin closer to her eyes. The letters were almost microscopic, but she could just make them out. "I'm coming back." Her mind reeled. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A cruel trick of the light, a figment of her exhausted imagination. She rubbed her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked again, holding the coin steady, her gaze fixed on the etched words. They were still there. "I'm coming back." A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the bench, her knuckles white, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. How could this be? Samuel was missing, presumed dead. She had received the telegram, seen the official report. And yet, here was his coin, in her hand, with a message that defied all logic, all reason. She stood up, her legs shaky, her body trembling. She paced back and forth, her mind racing. Had someone found him? Had he somehow escaped? Was he alive? The questions bombarded her, each one more improbable than the last. But the coin was undeniable proof. It was his. And the message, it was clearly meant for her. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of hope that she had thought extinguished. She had to find out the truth. She had to know. She looked around the garden, her eyes scanning the shadows, searching for any sign, any clue. There was no one there. Just the silent trees, the overgrown shrubs, the faint chirping of birds welcoming the dawn. She examined the coin again, turning it over and over in her hand, her mind working furiously. The etched letters, they were so small, so precise. They must have been made with a specialized tool, something a soldier wouldn't normally carry. A sudden thought struck her. The cipher. Samuel had mentioned a cipher, a secret code he and his fellow officers used to communicate sensitive information. He had never told her the details, but he had said it was based on a complex system of symbols and numbers. Could the coin be part of the cipher? Could the etched letters be a coded message, a clue to his whereabouts? It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at straws, but it was the only lead she had. She had to find someone who could help her decipher the message. Someone she could trust. Someone with knowledge of military codes and ciphers. But who? The hospital staff were mostly civilians, medical personnel with no experience in such matters. The officers she knew were either dead, wounded, or back at the front. Her mind raced, sifting through the faces, the names, the possibilities. And then a name surfaced. Captain Dubois, the head surgeon. He was a gruff, reserved man, but she had sensed a hidden depth beneath his stoic exterior. He had served in the previous war, she knew, and he had a reputation for being resourceful and discreet. He was her only hope. She clutched the coin tightly in her hand, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had to take a chance. She had to trust her instincts. She had to believe that Samuel was still alive, that he was trying to reach her. She turned and walked back towards the cathedral, her steps determined, her mind made up. She would find Captain Dubois. She would show him the coin. She would unravel the mystery. And she would find Samuel, no matter the cost. The second coin, a beacon of impossible hope, burned in her palm like a secret flame. It was a promise whispered across the battlefields, a promise she intended to see fulfilled. Chapter 4. Whispers of a Ghost. Finding Captain Dubois proved more difficult than Isabel anticipated. The morning brought a fresh wave of wounded, and the cathedral was once again a hive of activity. The operating theater, a makeshift affair separated from the main ward by a series of screens, was in constant use. The air reeked of ether and blood. Isabel searched for the surgeon, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. She checked the wards, the offices, even the small, cluttered room he used as a makeshift laboratory. He was nowhere to be found. She finally cornered one of the orderlies, a young man named Pierre, who often assisted Dr. Dubois. "Pierre," she said, her voice urgent, "have you seen Captain Dubois? It's important." Pierre looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and apprehension. He's in the chapel," he said, his voice hesitant. "But he's not to be disturbed." The chapel. It was a small, secluded space at the rear of the cathedral, a place where the staff often went to pray or find a moment of solitude. It was also a place where the dead were sometimes laid before being taken away for burial. Isabel's heart sank. Was Dubois mourning a patient? Or was there something more? She had to know. "Thank you, Pierre," she said, her voice firm. "I understand. But I must speak with him. It's a matter of life and death." She made her way to the chapel, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The air was cooler here, quieter, the sounds of the ward muted by the thick stone walls. She approached the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the heavy wooden door. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The chapel was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a few flickering candles placed before a small altar. The air was thick with the scent of incense and beeswax. In the center of the room, a figure knelt before the altar, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. It was Captain Dubois. Isabel approached him cautiously, her footsteps silent on the worn stone floor. She stopped a few feet away, hesitant to intrude on his grief. "Captain Dubois," she said softly. He didn't respond. He remained motionless, his body rigid, his head bowed. She spoke again, her voice louder this time. "Captain Dubois, I need to speak with you. It's urgent." He slowly raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed, his face haggard. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, as if he didn't recognize her. "Isabel," he said, his voice hoarse. What is it?" She held out her hand, the coin glinting in the candlelight. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about Samuel." His eyes widened, his gaze sharpening. He stared at the coin, his expression shifting from grief to disbelief. Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a long story," she said. "But I believe it's a message. From Samuel. He's alive." He reached out and took the coin, his fingers trembling. He turned it over and over in his hand, his eyes examining every detail. He focused on the edge, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The etching," he said, his voice low. "It's a cipher. A variation of the Vigenère cipher. We used it occasionally for highly sensitive communications." Isabel's heart leaped with hope. So she had been right. It was a coded message. "Can you decipher it?" she asked, her voice urgent. He nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "But I'll need some time. And I'll need to be alone." He looked around the chapel, his gaze lingering on the altar. "This is not the place," he said. "Meet me in my laboratory. In 1 hour. And tell no one." He handed the coin back to her, his hand brushing against hers. His fingers were cold, his grip surprisingly strong. 1 hour, she repeated, her voice firm. "And thank you, Captain." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. He seemed to have retreated back into his grief, his shoulders slumping, his head bowed. Isabel turned and left the chapel, her mind racing. She had a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread to cling to. But she also had a growing sense of unease. Dubois's reaction, his grief, his disbelief, his insistence on secrecy, it all felt off. She walked back towards the ward, her senses on high alert. She felt as if she were walking on a tightrope. One wrong step could send her plummeting into the abyss. The whispers of the wounded seemed to follow her, a chorus of ghostly voices murmuring secrets she couldn't quite grasp. The second coin felt heavy in her pocket, a weight of hope and uncertainty, a promise of a return that felt both impossibly close and impossibly far. She had 1 hour. 1 hour to prepare herself for whatever revelation awaited her. 1 hour to confront the ghosts of the past and the uncertain shadows of the future. Chapter 5. The Cipher and the Scars. The hour stretched, each minute an agonizing crawl. Isabel found it impossible to return to the ward, the clamor and suffering too much to bear with the secret churning within her. Instead, she sought refuge in the small, neglected garden, pacing restlessly among the overgrown weeds. The second coin, now tucked safely inside a small pouch she wore beneath her uniform, felt like a burning coal against her skin. She replayed her encounter with Captain Du Bois in her mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. His grief had seemed genuine, yet there was a guardedness in his eyes, a hesitancy that troubled her. Why the insistence on secrecy? Was he protecting her, Samuel, or himself? The war had bred suspicion and paranoia. Trust was a rare and precious commodity, easily broken, rarely repaired. Isabel had learned to be cautious, to rely on her instincts. And her instincts were screaming at her to be wary. But she had no choice. Du Bois was her only hope of deciphering the message. She had to trust him, at least for now. As the hour drew to a close, she made her way to Du Bois' laboratory, a small, cluttered room filled with beakers, test tubes, and strange-smelling concoctions. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals and disinfectant. Du Bois was already there, waiting for her. He was standing by a table, his back to the door, his shoulders hunched. He had a sheet of paper in front of him, covered in scribbled notes and diagrams. He turned as she entered, his face pale and drawn. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. "Isabel," he said, his voice flat. "I've deciphered the message." Her heart leaped with anticipation. "And?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "It's not good news," he said. "The message, it's incomplete." Garbled. Disappointment crashed over her, a wave of despair threatening to drown her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. He handed her the sheet of paper. "See for yourself," he said. "The key, it's based on a specific date and a keyword. The date is clear, it's the day Samuel went missing. But the keyword, it's missing. Or corrupted." Isabel scanned the paper, her eyes struggling to make sense of the complex symbols and equations. She recognized some of the elements of the Vigenère cipher, but the missing keyword made it impossible to decipher the full message. "Well, what does it say?" she asked, her voice desperate. "Even a partial message, it might give us a clue." Du Bois sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "There are fragments," he said. "Words, phrases that are recognizable. But they don't make sense. They're disjointed." He pointed to a section of the paper. "Here it says bridge and north and danger." He pointed to another section. "And here it says rendezvous and night and betrayal." Betrayal. The word sent a chill down her spine. It echoed the unease she had been feeling, the sense that something was terribly wrong. "Betrayal?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Who would betray him? Du Bois shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "But this message, it suggests that Samuel was in grave danger. That he was walking into a trap. A trap." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Isabel felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. "But the coin," she said, her voice desperate. "The message on the edge, I'm coming back. That means he's alive, doesn't it?" Du Bois looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. "Isabel," he said softly, "that message, it was not part of the cipher. It was added later. By someone else." Her mind reeled. Someone else? Who? And why? "But who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers again. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He seemed to be struggling with something, a conflict raging within him. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "Isabel," he said, "there's something you need to know. Something about Samuel. About his mission." He paused, taking a deep breath. "He wasn't just a soldier," he said. "He was an intelligence officer. He was working undercover, gathering information on enemy movements. And he discovered something. Something dangerous. Something that put his life at risk. Isabel stared at him, her mind struggling to absorb this new information. Samuel a spy? It seemed impossible. And yet it explained so much. His reticence, his guardedness, the secrets he had kept hidden. What would he discover? She asked, her voice trembling. Du Bois looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He discovered a traitor, he said. Someone within our own ranks. Someone who was selling information to the enemy. A traitor. The word echoed in her mind, a chilling confirmation of her worst fears. But who? Could it be Du Bois himself? The thought sent a shiver of fear through her. He seemed to read her mind. It wasn't me, Isabel, he said, his voice firm. I swear it. I would never betray Samuel. Or our country. The scars on his arms seemed to writhe under the dim lamplight, each a mark not just of battle, but of a past he couldn't escape. And within those scars, Isabel saw, or thought she saw, the truth. But what was the truth? Then who? She asked, her voice a desperate plea, her eyes locked on his, searching, needing to know the identity of the ghost that haunted them both. The answer, she sensed, was close, hidden within the cipher of his words, his scars, his very being. Chapter 6. A Rendezvous in Ruins. Du Bois' gaze held hers, a mixture of pain and resolve flickering in their depths. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for a difficult confession. The traitor, he began, his voice low and strained, was someone Samuel trusted. Someone close to him. He paused, his eyes darting around the cluttered laboratory as if the walls themselves might betray his words. It was Major Alistair Finch. Finch. The name struck Isabel like a physical blow. Major Finch was Samuel's commanding officer, a man known for his bravery and unwavering loyalty. He was a decorated veteran, a pillar of the British forces. It seemed impossible, unthinkable. Finch? She whispered, her voice incredulous. But he's a hero. He's saved countless lives. Du Bois nodded, his expression grim. That's what we all believed, he said. But Samuel, he uncovered evidence. Documents. Intercepted messages, proof that Finch was selling information to the Germans. Information about troop movements, supply lines, even the location of our field hospitals. The revelation sent a wave of nausea through Isabel. The thought that Finch, a man they had all admired and respected, was responsible for so much death and suffering, it was sickening.
But why?
She asked, her voice trembling. Why would he do such a thing? Du Bois shrugged, his shoulders slumping. Greed, perhaps, he said. Or blackmail. The Germans, they're ruthless. They'll use any means necessary to gain an advantage. He paused, his gaze fixed on a point beyond Isabel's shoulder. Samuel, he was planning to expose Finch, he continued. He had gathered enough evidence to bring him down. But Finch found out. He set a trap for Samuel. That's what the message, the fragments they refer to. The bridge, the rendezvous, it was all a setup. A setup. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, painting a grim and terrifying picture. Samuel had walked knowingly into a trap, lured by the promise of a meeting, a chance to gather more evidence. But instead, he had been betrayed, ambushed, captured, or worse. But the coin, Isabel said, her voice desperate. The message, I'm coming back, who sent it?
And why?
Du Bois looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness.
I don't know, he said.
But I suspect it was someone who knew about Finch's treachery. Someone who wanted to give you hope. Or perhaps a warning. A warning. The word sent a shiver down her spine. A warning about what? About Finch? About the dangers that still lurked, even now? We have to do something, she said, her voice firm. We have to expose Finch. We have to find Samuel. Du Bois shook his head. It's too dangerous, he said. Finch, he's powerful. He has connections. He'll silence us. He'll kill us. I don't care, Isabel said, her voice rising. I won't let him get away with this. I won't let him destroy Samuel's memory. I won't, she stopped, her voice choked with emotion. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had to be strong. She had to be brave. She had to fight. There's one more thing, Du Bois said, his voice hesitant. The message, the fragments, there's a location mentioned. A place near the front lines. A ruined village called Beaumont. Beaumont. The name rang a bell. It was a small village, a few miles from Amiens, that had been heavily shelled during the fighting. It was now deserted, a no-man's land between the opposing trenches. What about it? She asked, her voice urgent. Du Bois looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. I believe that's where Samuel was taken, he said. That's where Finch is holding him. Or where he disposed of him. Disposed of him. The words hung in the air, heavy and brutal. Isabel felt a cold hand grip her heart. We have to go there, she said, her voice firm. We have to find out what happened. We have to. She stopped, her gaze locking with Du Bois. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of hope, a glimmer of resolve. I'll go with you, he said, his voice low. I owe it to Samuel. I owe it to you. He stood up, his shoulders straightening, his gaze hardening. He looked different. Stronger, more determined. The grief was still there, but it was tempered by a newfound resolve. We'll leave tonight, he said. Under cover of darkness. It's our only chance. Tonight. The words sent a shiver of anticipation through her. She knew the risks. She knew the dangers. But she also knew that she couldn't stay here, doing nothing. She had to act. She had to fight. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm. Her heart was pounding, but, among the fragments of fear, a current of steely resolve ran through her. They made their plans in hushed whispers, their voices barely audible above the hum of the laboratory equipment. They would take a medical vehicle, posing as a routine supply run. They would avoid the main roads, sticking to the back routes, the less traveled paths. They would reach Beaumont by dawn. They left the lab and stood for a moment. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a question, a silent plea. Are you sure, Isabel? She nodded and looked into the night. I have to be, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 100 unspoken fears, of a love that refused to die, of a rendezvous in the ruins that might be their salvation, or their end. Chapter 7. Shadows of the Somme. The journey to Beaumont was a harrowing odyssey through a landscape ravaged by war. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Isabel and Du Bois navigated the battered medical vehicle along rutted, muddy tracks that were barely discernible from the surrounding fields. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a constant reminder of the death and destruction that permeated every inch of this forsaken land. Isabel sat beside Du Bois, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to conceal a hidden danger, every sound a potential threat. The distant rumble of artillery fire was a constant, ominous presence, a reminder that they were venturing into the heart of darkness. Du Bois drove with a grim determination, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He spoke little, his silence a reflection of the gravity of their mission. Isabel knew that he was carrying a heavy burden, the weight of his own guilt and regret, the knowledge that he had failed to protect Samuel. She, too, was battling her own demons. Fear, doubt, and a gnawing sense of despair threatened to overwhelm her. But she pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand, on the hope that Samuel was still alive, that they could somehow rescue him from Finch's clutches. The landscape they passed through was a testament to the brutal reality of war. Shell-scarred fields, shattered trees, abandoned trenches, it was a scene of utter desolation. They passed through deserted villages, their houses reduced to rubble, their streets littered with debris. The only signs of life were the occasional rats scurrying among the ruins and the crows circling overhead, their mournful cries echoing through the night. As they approached Beaumont, the landscape became even more bleak. The village had been at the center of a major offensive, a battleground where thousands of men had died. The ground was churned up, a vast expanse of mud and craters, littered with the detritus of war. Broken weapons, abandoned equipment, and the skeletal remains of horses and men. The air was heavy with the smell of death, a cloying sweetness that made Isabel's stomach churn. She pulled her scarf up over her nose, trying to block out the stench, but it was no use. The smell permeated everything, a constant reminder of the horrors that had taken place here. Du Bois slowed the vehicle, his eyes scanning the darkness. "We're close," he said, his voice low. "Beaumont, it's just ahead." Isabel peered through the windshield, her eyes straining to see through the gloom. She could just make out the outline of buildings, dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky. The village seemed to be shrouded in a veil of mist, a ghostly presence that sent a shiver down her spine. They drove slowly, cautiously, their headlights extinguished, relying on the faint moonlight to guide them. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of the tires on the muddy track and the distant rumble of artillery fire. They reached the outskirts of the village, a cluster of ruined buildings that loomed like skeletal sentinels. Du Bois stopped the vehicle, his hand reaching for the pistol he had tucked into his belt. "We'll go on foot from here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too dangerous to drive any further." Isabel nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a sense of dread, a premonition of danger. But she pushed it aside, steeling herself for what lay ahead. They climbed out of the vehicle, their footsteps muffled by the mud. The air was cold and damp, the silence broken only by the rustling of the wind through the shattered remnants of what had once been homes. They moved slowly, cautiously, sticking to the shadows, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The village was a maze of ruined buildings, collapsed walls, and rubble-strewn streets. It was a scene of utter devastation, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting that had taken place here. Isabel felt a sense of overwhelming sadness, a deep ache for the lives that had been lost, the homes that had been destroyed. They reached the center of the village, a small square that had once been the heart of the community. A ruined church stood on one side, its spire shattered, its windows gaping holes. On the other side, a collapsed building that might have been a town hall, its facade crumbling, its roof gone. Du Bois pointed towards the church. "That's where the message the fragments indicated," he said. "The rendezvous, it was supposed to be here." Isabel looked at the church, her heart sinking. It was a scene of utter desolation, a place of death and despair. She couldn't imagine Samuel being here, alive and well. But she had to believe.
She had to hold on to hope.
They approached the church cautiously, their weapons drawn, their senses on high alert. The shadows seemed to deepen around them, the silence becoming even more oppressive. They were walking into a trap, she knew, but they had no choice. They had to find Samuel. They had to confront Finch. They reached the entrance of the church, a gaping hole where the doors had once stood. Du Bois peered inside, his pistol raised. "Stay behind me," he whispered. He stepped inside, Isabel following close behind. The interior of the church was dark and cavernous, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. The moonlight filtered through the shattered windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The silence was broken only by the creaking of the wind through the ruined roof and the occasional scuttling of rats. They reached the altar, a shattered remnant of what had once been a place of worship. And there, lying on the floor, in a pool of dried blood, was a body. Isabel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a soldier, his uniform torn and bloodstained, his face pale and lifeless. It wasn't Samuel. Relief washed over her, followed by a renewed surge of fear. If it wasn't Samuel, then who was it? And where was Samuel? Du Bois knelt beside the body, his face grim. He examined the soldier's wounds, his expression darkening. "He's been tortured," he said, his voice low and strained. "And he's been dead for several days." Several days. The word sent a chill down Isabel's spine. The message on the coin, "I'm coming back," it had been a lie. A cruel deception. But who had sent it?
And why?
A sudden noise, a faint scraping sound, made them both freeze. It came from behind them, from the shadows near the entrance. Du Bois raised his pistol, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice firm. Silence. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight. It was Major Finch, and in the shadows behind, silhouetted against the faint light, stood two more figures, armed with rifles. The shadows of the Somme had delivered them to their reckoning. Chapter 8. The Price of Hope. Finch's smile was a chilling contrast to the grim surroundings, a predatory expression that sent a shiver of fear down Isabel's spine. He held a pistol in his hand, pointed casually at Du Bois, but his eyes were fixed on Isabel. Well, he said, his voice smooth and menacing. What a pleasant surprise. Nurse Hartley, I presume. And Captain Du Bois. I must say, I'm disappointed. I had hoped Samuel would have had the good sense to stay away. His words confirmed Isabel's worst fears. Samuel was alive, but he was in Finch's clutches. And Finch, he was even more dangerous, more ruthless, than she had imagined. Where is he, Finch? Isabel demanded, her voice trembling but firm. Where is Samuel? Finch chuckled, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the ruined church.
Oh, he's around, he said.
Let's just say he's indisposed at the moment. He gestured with his pistol towards Du Bois. As for you, Captain, he said, his voice hardening, you should have stayed out of this. You've made a grave mistake. Du Bois stood his ground, his pistol still raised, his eyes locked on Finch's. I know what you've done, Finch, he said, his voice steady. I know about the information you've been selling. I know about Samuel's mission. Finch's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. You know nothing, he spat. You're a fool, Du Bois. A meddling fool. I know enough, Du Bois retorted. And I'm not afraid of you. Finch laughed again, a harsh, mocking sound. You should be, he said. You have no idea what you're dealing with. He turned his attention back to Isabel, his eyes narrowing. As for you, Nurse Hartley, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Your devotion to Lieutenant Hayes is touching, but misguided. He's a traitor, you know. A spy. He deserves whatever he gets. You're the traitor, Finch, Isabel shot back, her voice filled with anger and defiance. You're the one who's been selling secrets to the enemy. You're the one who's responsible for countless deaths. Finch's eyes flickered, a momentary flicker of something that might have been guilt, but it was quickly gone, replaced by a look of cold calculation. You have no proof, he said. It's your word against mine. And who do you think they'll believe? A decorated officer or a lovesick nurse? He took a step closer, his pistol still pointed at Du Bois. It's a shame, he said, his voice low and menacing.
It didn't have to be this way.
But you forced my hand. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Du Bois' head. Isabel gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to do something, anything, to stop him. But before she could react, a shot rang out. It wasn't Finch's pistol. It came from behind him, from one of the armed figures in the shadows. Finch staggered, his eyes widening in surprise. He looked down at his chest, where a dark stain was spreading across his uniform. He crumpled to the ground, his pistol falling from his hand. The two armed figures stepped forward, their rifles lowered. They were British soldiers. But they weren't Finch's men. One of them stepped forward, his face grim, his eyes fixed on Du Bois. Captain Du Bois, he said, his voice firm. We're with military intelligence. We've been tracking Finch for weeks. We know everything. Military intelligence. The words sent a wave of relief through Isabel. They were safe. Finch was dead. But what about Samuel? Where is he? She asked, her voice urgent. Where is Lieutenant Hayes? The soldier looked at her, his expression softening. He's alive, he said. But he's injured. He's being taken care of.
Alive.
The word echoed in her mind, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He was alive. She had to see him. Take me to him, she pleaded. Please. I need to see him. The soldier hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Follow me, he said. He led her out of the church, Du Bois following close behind. They made their way through the ruined village, the air still thick with the smell of death and gunpowder. They reached a small, makeshift medical tent, hidden among the rubble. The soldier lifted the flap, and Isabel stepped inside. And there, lying on a cot, his face pale and bandaged, but his eyes open and filled with a familiar warmth, was Samuel. She rushed to his side, her heart overflowing with relief and joy. She knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. His grip was weak, but his smile was strong. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice hoarse. You came." "Of course I came," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I never gave up hope." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners.
"I knew you wouldn't," he said.
"The coin, you got my message." "Yes," she said, "but another one confused me. The second coin, it confused us all." He shook his head slightly, the cost of movement visibly straining on him. "I'll explain it all." "But not now." Later he whispered. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming love. She leaned down and kissed him, a gentle, tender kiss that conveyed all the emotions she couldn't express in words. The price of hope had been high, paid in blood and fear, in betrayal and loss. But in the end, it had been worth it. She had found him. He was alive. And that was all that mattered. The war raged on. The world outside was still a place of darkness and despair, but in this small, fragile sanctuary, love had triumphed. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 9. Between Duty and Desire. The days that followed were a blur of anxious recovery and whispered revelations. Samuel was transported back to the Cathedral Hospital in Amiens, where Isabel could tend to him alongside her other duties. His injuries were serious: a gunshot wound to the shoulder, several broken ribs, and the lingering effects of torture, but he was strong, his will to live fueled by the reunion with Isabel. The presence of military intelligence cast a long shadow over the hospital. The investigation into Finch's treachery was swift and brutal, uncovering a network of collaborators and a trail of devastating consequences. Many were arrested, some were summarily executed. The war, it seemed, had its own ruthless justice. Isabel, however, found herself increasingly detached from the external turmoil. Her world had narrowed to the confines of Samuel's recovery room, a small, private space carved out of the bustling ward. She spent every spare moment by his side, tending to his wounds, reading to him, or simply holding his hand, their silent communion a balm to both their souls. As Samuel regained his strength, he began to share the details of his ordeal, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. He confirmed Du Bois' account of Finch's treachery, the betrayal that had nearly cost him his life. He spoke of the interrogation, the torture, the desperate hope that someone, somehow, would find him. The first coin, he explained, his voice still weak but gaining strength each day, was a message I managed to smuggle out with a sympathetic guard. He was a young man, disillusioned with the war. He took a risk, a great risk, to help me. And the second? Isabel asked, the question that had haunted her for days. The one that said, "I'm coming back." Samuel hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. That was Finch," he said, his voice low. He found out about the first coin. He wanted to play with me. To give you false hope. To draw you into his trap. A chill ran down Isabel's spine. The cruelty of it, the calculated manipulation, it was almost beyond comprehension. He enjoyed it, Samuel continued, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disgust. He took pleasure in my suffering. In yours. Isabel reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. She squeezed gently, her touch conveying all the love and support she couldn't express in words. "It's over now," she said, her voice firm.
"He's gone.
You're safe." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep gratitude.
"Thanks to you," he said. "And Du Bois.
I owe you both my life." The mention of Du Bois brought a flicker of unease to Isabel's mind. She still harbored a lingering doubt, a suspicion that there was more to the story than she knew. But she pushed it aside, focusing on Samuel, on his recovery, on their future together. The future. It was a word that held both promise and uncertainty. The war was still raging, the outcome far from certain. And even if they survived, what then? a nurse and a now former intelligence officer. Their paths had diverged so drastically, their lives shaped by different forces. Could they bridge the gap? Could they find a way to be together? The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but ever-present. They were both aware of the obstacles, the challenges that lay ahead. But they were also aware of the powerful bond that had formed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of war, strengthened by shared suffering and unwavering love. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Samuel reached out and took Isabel's hand. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and something else. Something that made her heart skip a beat. "Isabel," he said, his voice low and earnest. I know things are complicated, but I don't want to lose you. I can't imagine my life without you." Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. She had waited so long to hear those words, to know that her feelings were reciprocated. "I feel the same way, Samuel," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I love you." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows. But even in that moment of perfect happiness, a shadow lingered. The shadow of duty, of responsibility, of the war that still raged outside their sanctuary. Samuel was still a soldier, albeit one on extended medical leave. He had obligations, commitments, a duty to his country. And Isabel, she was a nurse, bound by her own sense of duty, her commitment to caring for the wounded, the suffering. Their love was undeniable, their desire for each other palpable. But they were caught between two worlds, between the demands of their hearts and the realities of their lives. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges. But they were determined to face it together, to navigate the treacherous terrain between duty and desire, to find a way to build a future, a life, together. Their love, forged in the fires of war, would be their guide, their strength, their hope. Chapter 10. The Spy Among Us. The relative peace of Samuel's recovery was shattered by a coded message delivered discreetly to Du Bois during one of his routine checkups on Samuel. The surgeon's face, usually stoic, paled considerably as he read the note, his hand trembling slightly. He excused himself abruptly, leaving Isabel and Samuel in a state of heightened anxiety. "What do you think it is?" Isabel asked, her voice laced with apprehension. Samuel shook his head, his brow furrowed.
"I don't know," he said.
But Du Bois' reaction, it wasn't good. An hour later, Du Bois returned, his expression grim. He closed the door behind him, his gaze shifting between Isabel and Samuel. "There's been a development," he said, his voice low and strained. "The message, it's from military intelligence. They believe there's another spy. Someone within the hospital. Another spy." The word sent a chill down Isabel's spine. The nightmare wasn't over. Finch was gone, but the threat remained. "Who?" Samuel asked, his voice sharp.
"Who do they suspect?"
Du Bois hesitated, his gaze lingering on Isabel. They don't have a name," he said. "But they have a description. Someone with access to medical records. Someone who has been asking questions about Samuel's case." Isabel felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. The description, it fit her. She had access to medical records. She had been asking questions about Samuel. She had been desperate to find him. They suspect me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's absurd," he said, his voice rising. "You would never," he stopped, his gaze locking with Du Bois. He saw the doubt in the surgeon's eyes, the flicker of suspicion. "Du Bois," he said, his voice firm. "You don't believe this, do you? You know Isabel. You know she would never betray us." Du Bois sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I don't want to believe it," he said. "But the evidence, it's circumstantial, but compelling." "What evidence?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling. "What have I done that could possibly make them suspect me?" Du Bois outlined the case, his voice devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a medical report. Her frequent inquiries about Samuel's condition, her unauthorized visit to Beaumont, Her close relationship with a known intelligence officer, it all painted a suspicious picture. They also intercepted a message, Du Bois continued. A coded message sent from Lemien. It had contained information about Samuel's recovery. Information that only a few people knew. Isabel felt a wave of despair wash over her. It was a setup. Someone was framing her, trying to make her look like the spy. But who?
And why?
It wasn't me, she said, her voice desperate. I swear it. I would never betray Samuel. I would never betray my country. Samuel reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I believe you, Isabel, he said. I know you wouldn't do this. But even as he spoke, she saw the doubt flickering in his eyes. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was growing, threatening to poison their love, their trust. We need to find the real spy, she said, her voice firm. We need to clear my name. We need to. She stopped, her mind racing. She had to think, to find a way out of this nightmare. The message, she said. The coded message, can you decipher it? Du Bois nodded. I already have, he said. It's similar to the one Samuel used, but different. More sophisticated. Can you trace it? Samuel asked. Can you find out who sent it?
Du Bois shook his head.
It's untraceable, he said. They're too good. They've covered their tracks. Too good. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. They were dealing with a professional, someone who knew how to operate in the shadows, someone who was always one step ahead. Isabel felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to fight back. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them destroy her life, her love. There has to be a way, she said, her voice rising. There has to be something we can do. She looked at Samuel, her eyes pleading for his help, his support. He was an intelligence officer after all. He knew how to deal with spies, with deception. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. We'll figure it out, Isabel, he said. We'll find the real spy. And we'll clear your name. I promise you. He turned to Du Bois. We need your help, Captain, he said. You know this hospital. You know the people. You must have some idea who it could be. Du Bois hesitated, his gaze shifting between Isabel and Samuel. He seemed to be wrestling with something, a conflict raging within him. The trust was broken, the atmosphere thick with suspicion. Who was the spy among them? The answer, it seemed, was hidden within the walls of the very place that was meant to heal, a cruel irony in a world already overflowing with them. The hunt was on, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 11. Letters Unsent. Du Bois remained hesitant, his eyes clouded with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Something Isabel couldn't quite decipher. Guilt? Fear? She couldn't be sure. I have my suspicions, Du Bois admitted, his voice low. But they're just that. Suspicions. I have no proof. Tell us, Samuel urged, his voice firm. We need to consider every possibility. Du Bois sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. He looked around the room, as if checking for eavesdroppers, even though they were alone. There are a few people, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. People who have behaved strangely. People who have asked questions. People who have access. He mentioned a few names, nurses, orderlies, even another doctor. Each name was a potential suspect, each one a possible traitor. Isabel listened intently, her mind racing, trying to find a connection, a pattern, anything that could lead them to the real spy. But as Du Bois spoke, a nagging feeling of unease grew within her. Something wasn't right. Something about Du Bois' demeanor, his hesitancy, his evasiveness, it all felt off. She remembered the day she had found the second coin, the day she had gone to Du Bois for help. His grief had seemed genuine, but there had also been a guardedness in his eyes, a reluctance to reveal too much. And then there was the deciphered message, the one that had implicated her. Du Bois had claimed it was untraceable, that the spy was too good. But was that really true? Or was Du Bois hiding something? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Could Du Bois be the spy? It seemed impossible. He was a respected surgeon, a veteran, a man who had dedicated his life to healing. But the war had changed people. It had broken them, twisted them, turned them into something unrecognizable. She had seen it happen before. She looked at Samuel, her eyes searching his. She saw the trust in his gaze, the unwavering belief in her innocence. But she also saw the doubt, the flicker of suspicion that had been planted by Du Bois' words. She had to be careful. She couldn't trust anyone, not completely. Not even Du Bois. Not even Samuel. The thought was painful, a betrayal of the love they shared. But she had to be realistic. She had to protect herself. Du Bois, she said, her voice calm but firm. I need to see the original message. The one you deciphered. I want to examine it myself. Du Bois hesitated, his eyes narrowing.
Why?
He asked. What do you hope to find?
I don't know, she said.
But I have a feeling. Something doesn't add up. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, his hand brushing against hers. His fingers were cold, his grip surprisingly strong. Isabel unfolded the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the coded message, the one that had implicated her. She scanned the symbols, the numbers, the familiar pattern of the cipher. And then she saw it. A small detail, almost imperceptible, but significant. A slight variation in the way one of the symbols was drawn, a subtle difference that only someone familiar with the cipher would notice. It was a mistake. A deliberate mistake. The spy hadn't been too good. He had made a mistake. And that mistake pointed directly at Du Bois. She looked up at him, her eyes locking with his. She saw the fear in his gaze, the realization that she had discovered his secret. You, she whispered, her voice trembling. It was you all along. Du Bois didn't deny it. He simply stared at her, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly together. Samuel looked from Isabel to Du Bois, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. What's going on? He asked. Du Bois, is she right? Are you the spy? Du Bois didn't answer. He just stood there, silent and defeated. Isabel held up the message, her hand shaking. This mistake, she said. It's a signature. A way of identifying yourself. You used it before. In other messages. She remembered something Samuel had told her, about his work as an intelligence officer, about the way spies often used personal quirks, subtle variations in their codes, to identify themselves to their contacts. Du Bois had made a mistake. He had used his signature, his personal quirk, in the message that was meant to frame her. He had been too confident, too sure of himself. Why, Du Bois? Samuel asked, his voice filled with anguish. Why would you do this? You were our friend. We trusted you. Du Bois finally spoke, his voice low and strained. I had no choice, he said. They threatened me. They had something on me. Something from my past. He spoke of a youthful indiscretion, a mistake he had made years ago, before the war. The Germans had discovered it, and they had used it to blackmail him, to force him to work for them. He had been passing information to them for months, feeding them details about troop movements, supply lines, hospital locations. He had been responsible for countless deaths, for unimaginable suffering. And then Samuel had arrived, with his investigation into Finch. Du Bois had known that Samuel was getting close, that he was about to uncover the truth. He had to stop him. He had planted the second coin, with its false message of hope, to lure Isabel into a trap. He had hoped that Finch would kill them both, silencing them forever. But Finch had failed. And now, Du Bois' secret was out. Tears streamed down Du Bois' face, tears of shame, of guilt, of regret. He looked at Samuel, his eyes pleading for forgiveness. I'm sorry, he whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. Or Isabel. Samuel stared at him, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. He had trusted Du Bois, had considered him a friend. And now he realized that he had been betrayed by the very man he had confided in. Isabel felt a surge of pity for Du Bois. He was a broken man, a victim of his own past, a pawn in a deadly game. But she also felt anger, a fierce resentment for the damage he had done, the lives he had ruined. It's over, Du Bois, she said, her voice firm. You need to turn yourself in. You need to confess. In his coat pocket, he found a stack of unsent letters addressed to a woman in Germany. They were love letters, filled with longing and regret, with a desperate hope for a future that would never be. The letters unsent, the love unfulfilled, the betrayal complete. They were the final piece of the puzzle, the proof of his duplicity, the echoes of a life he had chosen to betray. Chapter 12. The Map of Memories. The arrest of Du Bois sent shockwaves through the hospital. The man who had been a respected colleague, a trusted surgeon, was now revealed to be a traitor, a spy who had betrayed his country and his comrades. The staff was stunned, disbelief mixing with anger and a sense of profound betrayal. For Isabel and Samuel, the revelation brought a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the real spy had been caught, that Isabel's name had been cleared. Sadness for the man they had thought they knew, the man who had been their friend. But the ordeal wasn't over. Du Bois' confession had opened up a new can of worms, revealing a network of collaborators and a trail of unanswered questions. Military intelligence intensified their investigation, determined to root out every last vestige of the enemy's influence. Samuel, despite his injuries, insisted on being involved. His knowledge of ciphers and intelligence gathering was invaluable, and he felt a personal responsibility to help bring the remaining traitors to justice. Isabel, however, found herself increasingly drawn back to her nursing duties. The constant influx of wounded soldiers, the overwhelming suffering, demanded her attention. She found solace in her work, in the ability to ease pain, to offer comfort, to make a tangible difference in the lives of others. But she couldn't completely escape the shadow of the investigation. The hospital was still under scrutiny, the staff still viewed with suspicion. And Isabel herself was still a person of interest, her relationship with Samuel making her a potential target, a possible source of information. One evening, as she was tending to a young soldier with a severe head wound, she noticed a small, intricately carved wooden box tucked beneath his pillow. It was an unusual object for a soldier to carry, and it piqued her curiosity. "What's this?" she asked, her voice gentle. The soldier, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion, looked at her blankly. "I don't know," he mumbled. It's just a box." Isabel carefully picked up the box, examining it closely. It was made of dark wood, possibly oak, and it was covered in intricate carvings, depicting scenes of battles, soldiers, and strange symbols. The symbols, they looked familiar. She had seen them before, somewhere. She remembered Samuel's work on the ciphers, the complex patterns and codes he had deciphered. Could this box be connected to the investigation? Could it be a clue? She decided to show it to Samuel. He was in his room, poring over documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she entered, his face brightening at the sight of her. "Isabel," he said, a smile gracing his lips. "What brings you here?" She held up the box. "I found this," she said, "with one of my patients. I think it might be important." Samuel took the box from her, his eyes widening as he examined the carvings. This is incredible," he said. "These symbols, they're a variation of the Vigenère cipher, but more complex, more ancient." He traced the carvings with his finger, his mind racing. "This box, it's a key," he said. "A key to something. Something big." He spent the next few hours studying the box, meticulously copying the symbols, comparing them to other ciphers, searching for a pattern, a connection. Isabel watched him, her admiration for his intellect and his dedication growing with each passing minute. He was a remarkable man, a brilliant mind trapped in a broken body. Finally, as dawn approached, he made a breakthrough. "I've got it," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "The box, it's a map. A map of memories." A map of memories? The phrase sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. What did it mean? Samuel explained that the symbols on the box corresponded to specific locations, places where Du Bois had met with his German contacts, places where he had exchanged information, places where secrets were buried. The box was a roadmap to Du Bois' treachery, a guide to the network of collaborators he had worked with. "We need to follow the map," Samuel said, his voice firm. "We need to uncover the truth. We need to bring them all to justice." Isabel nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was dangerous, potentially deadly. But they had to do it. They had to finish what Du Bois had started. The map led them on a journey through the war-torn landscape to abandoned villages, ruined chateaus, and hidden bunkers. Each location revealed a new piece of the puzzle, a new clue to the extent of Du Bois' betrayal. They discovered secret caches of weapons, coded messages, and a list of names. Names of people who had collaborated with Du Bois, people who were still at large, people who posed a threat to the Allied forces. The list included high-ranking officers, government officials, and even some of the medical staff at the hospital. The revelation sent a shockwave through Isabel and Samuel. The betrayal was far deeper, far more widespread than they had ever imagined. They knew they had to act quickly. They had to expose the remaining traitors before they could do any more damage. They decided to return to the first location. They knew what awaited. Chapter 13. Broken Vows, Renewed Promises. The first location on the map of memories was a small, isolated farmhouse on the outskirts of Amiens, a place where Du Bois had met with his German contact on several occasions. According to the coded messages they had deciphered, a crucial piece of information was hidden there: a detailed plan of the Allied defenses along the Somme. Isabel and Samuel approached the farmhouse under cover of darkness, their hearts pounding with a mixture of apprehension and determination. They knew the risks were immense. If the remaining collaborators were still active, they would be guarding the information carefully, prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose them. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows, their senses on high alert. The farmhouse was dark and silent, seemingly deserted. But they knew better than to assume anything. Samuel, his movements still hampered by his injuries, leaned heavily on Isabel for support. She felt the warmth of his body against hers, the strength of his grip on her arm. It was a comforting presence, a reminder of the bond they shared, the love that sustained them through the darkness. They reached the farmhouse, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Samuel signaled for Isabel to stay back while he checked the perimeter. He moved slowly, silently, his eyes scanning the windows, the doors, searching for any sign of movement. He returned a few minutes later, his face grim. "The front door is locked," he whispered. "But there's a window at the back. It's slightly ajar." They made their way to the back of the farmhouse, their hearts pounding in their chests. Samuel carefully pushed the window open, his hand reaching inside to unlatch the lock. He slipped inside, Isabel following close behind. The interior of the farmhouse was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. They moved slowly, cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards and the distant rumble of artillery fire. They reached the main room, a sparsely furnished space with a fireplace, a table, and a few chairs. The room was empty, seemingly untouched for months. "Where is it?" Isabel whispered. "Where's the information?" Samuel pointed to the fireplace. "According to the code," he said, "it's hidden behind the hearthstone." They approached the fireplace, their eyes fixed on the large, flat stone that formed the base of the hearth. Samuel knelt down, his fingers tracing the edges of the stone, searching for a way to move it. He found a small, almost imperceptible crack, and he inserted the tip of his knife, prying gently. The stone shifted slightly, revealing a narrow gap. He worked carefully, patiently, his muscles straining with the effort. Finally, with a loud groan, the hearthstone moved, sliding to one side. Behind it, they found a small, metal box, secured with a heavy padlock. Samuel's face lit up with excitement.
"This is it," he said.
"This is the information." But before he could reach for the box, a voice spoke from the shadows. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." They froze, their hearts leaping into their throats. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the moonlight. It was a woman, dressed in a nurse's uniform, her face pale and drawn. She held a pistol in her hand, pointed directly at Samuel. Isabel recognized her instantly. It was Nurse Moreau, one of the senior nurses at the hospital, a woman she had worked alongside for months, a woman she had considered a friend. Moreau? Isabel whispered, her voice incredulous. You're one of them? Moreau's smile was chilling, devoid of any warmth or compassion.
Surprised?
She said, her voice cold and hard. I thought you were smarter than that, Isabel. I thought you suspected. Isabel felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been so blind, so trusting. She had worked alongside this woman, shared meals with her, confided in her, and all the while, Moreau had been a spy, a traitor, working for the enemy. Why Moreau? Isabel asked, her voice trembling. Why would you do this? Moreau shrugged, her shoulders slumping. Money, she said. They offered me a lot of money. Enough to escape this hellhole. Enough to start a new life. She gestured with the pistol towards the box. That information, she said, is worth a fortune. It's my ticket out of here. You won't get away with this, Moreau, Samuel said, his voice firm. We'll stop you. Moreau laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You? She said. You're wounded. You're weak. You're no match for me. She raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Samuel's head. Isabel gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to do something, anything, to save him. But before she could react, Samuel moved. With a sudden burst of speed, he lunged forward, knocking Moreau off balance. The pistol fired, the bullet whizzing past Samuel's ear. Isabel screamed, rushing forward to help him. She tackled Moreau, wresting the pistol from her grasp. The two women struggled, grappling on the floor, their bodies intertwined. Isabel fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to protect the man she loved. Finally, with a surge of strength, she managed to overpower Moreau, pinning her to the ground, the pistol pressed against her throat. It's over, Moreau, Isabel said, her voice trembling with rage and exhaustion. It's over. Later, sitting and watching Samuel sleep, after Amai had taken Moreau, she saw him stir. He opened his eyes, looked at her. Marry me, he whispered, his voice still rough with sleep. Marry me, Isabel. She smiled, and leaned to place a soft kiss on his lips. Yes, she said. The broken vows of others had cleared the path for their own, renewed promises in a world desperately seeking a future. Chapter 14. The Heart of No Man's Land. The proposal hung in the air, a fragile promise amidst the lingering echoes of violence and betrayal. Isabel's yes was a whisper of hope, a defiant act of love against the backdrop of war's relentless cruelty. But the reality of their situation, the ongoing investigation, and Samuel's precarious health cast a long shadow over their newfound commitment. Military intelligence took Moreau into custody, extracting a full confession and unraveling the remaining threads of Du Bois' spy network. The information hidden in the farmhouse proved crucial, leading to the arrest of several high-ranking officers and disrupting German plans for a major offensive along the Somme. Samuel, despite his weakened condition, played a key role in the interrogations, his expertise in ciphers and intelligence gathering proving invaluable. He was hailed as a hero, his bravery and dedication recognized by his superiors. But the accolades meant little to him. His focus was on Isabel, on their future together, on building a life beyond the war. Isabel, meanwhile, continued her work at the hospital, tending to the endless stream of wounded soldiers. The experience with Moreau had shaken her deeply, leaving her with a profound sense of disillusionment. She found it difficult to trust anyone, her faith in humanity shattered by the betrayal of someone she had considered a friend. But she found solace in her work, in the ability to alleviate suffering, to offer comfort, to make a tangible difference in the lives of others. And she found strength in Samuel's love, in his unwavering belief in her, in his determination to build a future together. One evening, as they sat together in Samuel's room, sharing a quiet moment amidst the chaos of the hospital, he took her hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and something else. Something that made her heart skip a beat. Isabel, he said, his voice low and earnest. I know things are difficult, but I wanna get married.
Soon.
Before he didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. Before he was sent back to the front. Before they were separated again, perhaps forever. The thought sent a shiver of fear down her spine. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him again. She had come so close to losing him so many times. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Samuel. I want to marry you.
Now.
As soon as possible." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows. They decided to have a small, private ceremony in the ruined chapel of the cathedral, the same place where they had confronted Finch, the same place where their love had been tested and reaffirmed. They invited only a few close friends, fellow nurses, and a couple of Samuel's colleagues from military intelligence. They didn't want a grand affair, a public spectacle. They wanted something intimate, something meaningful, something that reflected the unique circumstances of their love. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a rare respite from the usual gloom and rain. Isabel wore a simple white dress, borrowed from one of the other nurses, and a veil made of lace salvaged from a bombed-out shop. Samuel wore his uniform, his wounds still bandaged, but his eyes shining with happiness. The ceremony was brief and poignant, conducted by a chaplain who had seen his share of wartime weddings. The ruined chapel, with its shattered windows and crumbling walls, seemed an unlikely setting for a celebration of love, but it felt strangely appropriate. It was a symbol of resilience, of hope amidst destruction, of the enduring power of the human spirit. As they exchanged their vows, Isabel felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of joy, gratitude, and a profound sense of peace. She had found her love, her soulmate, in the most unlikely of places, in the heart of a brutal war. After the ceremony, they had a small reception in the hospital mess hall, sharing a simple meal with their friends. There was no music, no dancing, no elaborate decorations. But there was laughter, there were tears, there was a sense of shared camaraderie, of a community bound together by shared experiences, by shared hopes and dreams. As the evening drew to a close, Samuel and Isabel slipped away, seeking a moment of privacy amidst the crowd. They walked hand in hand through the hospital gardens, the same gardens where Isabel had found the second coin, the same gardens where their love had blossomed amidst the ruins. They stopped beneath a large oak tree, its branches reaching up towards the sky, its leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Samuel turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with love and devotion. "Isabel," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I can't promise you an easy life. I can't promise you a life without danger. But I can promise you my love. My unwavering, unconditional love. Forever." Tears streamed down Isabel's face, tears of joy, of gratitude, of overwhelming love. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, the scars that were a testament to his bravery, his resilience. "I will walk it with you," she said. He pulled a small box from the inside pocket that had held the coins. Inside, a simple gold band. He took her hand, slipped the ring. They were husband and wife, bound together by love, by shared experiences, by a future as uncertain as the shifting sands of no man's land, but filled with a hope as enduring as the human spirit itself. They had found their love in the heart of darkness, and they would face whatever came next, together. Chapter 15. A dance with deception. The fragile peace of their marriage was soon tested. Despite his injuries and his official status as being on medical leave, Samuel was drawn back into the world of intelligence. The information gleaned from Du Bois' network had revealed a disturbing pattern of leaks and compromised operations, suggesting a deeper, more insidious infiltration than they had initially suspected. Military intelligence requested Samuel's assistance, and he, driven by a sense of duty and a thirst for justice, couldn't refuse. Isabel understood his commitment, but the fear for his safety gnawed at her. The war had already taken so much from them, she couldn't bear the thought of losing him again. She tried to focus on her work at the hospital, finding solace in the routine and the tangible impact she had on the lives of the wounded. But every distant explosion, Every ambulance arriving with its cargo of broken bodies sent a jolt of anxiety through her. Samuel's investigation led him to a series of clandestine meetings, coded messages, and shadowy figures. He discovered that the leaks weren't confined to the military, they extended into the civilian population, the government, even the medical community. The enemy had woven a web of deception that reached into every corner of society. One evening, Samuel returned to their small room, his face pale and drawn. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. "Isabel," he said, his voice low and strained. "I need your help." Her heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked. "What's happened?" He explained that he had uncovered evidence of a planned attack, a major offensive targeting a crucial supply depot near Amiens. The information had come from a coded message intercepted by military intelligence, but the details were incomplete. He needed to find the missing piece of the puzzle, the key to deciphering the full plan. "The message, it refers to a specific location," he said. "A place within the hospital. A place known only to a few people." He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "It's the old apothecary," he said. "The one that was damaged during the shelling. The one that's been closed off." The old apothecary. Isabel knew the place well. It was a small, secluded room at the rear of the hospital, filled with shelves of dusty bottles and jars, remnants of a bygone era of medicine. It had been damaged during a recent artillery attack and had been sealed off ever since. "Why there?" she asked. "What's so special about that place?" Samuel explained that the apothecary had been used before the war by a small group of doctors and pharmacists who were experimenting with unconventional treatments. They had been researching herbal remedies, ancient cures, and even some occult practices. "The message, it suggests that something is hidden there," he said. "Something related to the attack. Something that could help us stop it." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. The old apothecary, it had always given her a creepy feeling. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a place where the boundaries between science and superstition blurred. "We need to go there," Samuel said. "We need to find whatever is hidden there. We need to do it tonight." Tonight. The word sent a shiver of apprehension through her. It was dangerous, potentially deadly, but she knew she couldn't refuse. She had to help him. She had to protect him. They waited until the hospital was quiet, the ward shrouded in darkness, the only sounds the occasional moans of the wounded and the distant rumble of artillery fire. They slipped out of their room, making their way through the deserted corridors, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. They reached the old apothecary, the entrance sealed off with boards and warning signs. Samuel carefully removed the boards, his movements slow and deliberate. He pushed the door open and they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, a musty odor that made Isabel's stomach churn. The moonlight filtered through the shattered windows, casting eerie shadows on the shelves, the bottles, the jars. They moved slowly, cautiously, their eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of what? A hidden message? A secret compartment? A clue? They searched for hours, examining every bottle, every jar, every shelf. They found nothing. Just as they were about to give up, Isabel noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible crack in one of the walls, behind a large, ornate cabinet. "Samuel," she whispered. "Look." He came over and examined the crack. He inserted the tip of his knife, prying gently. The wall shifted slightly, revealing a narrow opening. Behind the wall, they found a small, hidden room. And inside the room, they found a woman. She was sitting on a stool, her head bowed, her hands tied behind her back. She was dressed in a simple dress, her hair disheveled, her face pale and bruised. Isabel recognized her instantly. It was Dr. Simone Moreau. But that was impossible. She had been taken away. Simone raised and looked into Isabel's face. Her eyes were wide, pleading. The dance of deception, it seemed, was far from over. Chapter 16. The Nightingale's Song. The sight of Simone Moreau, bound and bruised in the hidden room, sent a wave of shock and confusion through Isabel. Simone was Major Moreau's niece, a respected physician, a colleague, someone Isabel had trusted. She had been arrested with the others, with the breaking of the spy ring.
Simone?
Isabel whispered, her voice incredulous. What are you doing here?
How?
Simone looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Isabel, she pleaded, her voice hoarse. You have to help me. They're going to kill me. Who? Samuel asked, his voice sharp. Who is going to kill you? Simone hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if she expected someone to appear from the shadows.
The others, she said.
The ones who are still out there. They think I betrayed them. Betrayed them? Isabel's mind reeled. Was Simone not a collaborator? Was she a victim? Or was this another layer of deception, a carefully crafted ruse to escape justice? What others, Simone? Samuel pressed, his tone firm but not unkind. Tell us who they are. We can protect you. Simone began to speak, her voice halting and fragmented, her story a jumble of fear and half-truths. She claimed that she had been forced to work for the spy ring, threatened with the safety of her family if she didn't cooperate. She insisted that she had never willingly betrayed her country, that she had been a pawn in a deadly game. I try to help, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I left clues. I tried to warn you. Clues? Warnings? Isabel remembered the second coin, the one with the message, I'm coming back. Had that been Simone? Had she been trying to reach out to them, to expose the truth?
The coin, Isabel said. Was that you?
Did you send the second coin? Simone nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, she whispered. I took it from Samuel's belongings. I etched the message. I hoped you would understand. Understanding flickered in Isabel's mind, a glimmer of possibility amidst the darkness of doubt. But there were still too many unanswered questions. Too many inconsistencies. If you were trying to help, Samuel asked, why didn't you come forward sooner? Why didn't you tell us everything? Simone hesitated, her gaze shifting away from his. I was afraid, she said. They were watching me. They would have killed me. But you're here now, Isabel said. You're safe. We can protect you. Simone shook her head, her eyes filled with despair.
It's too late, she said.
They know I'm here. They're coming for me. As if on cue, a noise from outside the apothecary shattered the tense silence. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching the entrance. Samuel's hand instinctively went to the pistol he carried, his body tensing for action. They're here, he said, his voice low and urgent. We need to get out of here. But it was too late. The door to the apothecary burst open, and several figures rushed inside, their weapons drawn. They were soldiers, but they weren't wearing British uniforms. They were Germans. A firefight erupted, the small space filled with a deafening roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of the wounded. Samuel returned fire, his movements hampered by his injuries, but his aim still true. Isabel, despite her lack of combat experience, found herself caught in the crossfire. She grabbed a heavy glass bottle from a nearby shelf and hurled it at one of the attackers, striking him in the head and knocking him off balance. Simone, despite being bound, tried to help, kicking out at one of the soldiers who came too close, her movements desperate and frantic. The battle was fierce but brief. Samuel, despite his injuries, managed to take down two of the attackers, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. One of the German soldiers grabbed Isabel, holding a knife to her throat. Drop your weapon, he snarled at Samuel, his voice thick with a German accent. Or the nurse dies. Samuel hesitated, his eyes locking with Isabel's. He saw the fear in her gaze, but he also saw something else. He saw defiance. He saw love. He slowly lowered his pistol, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't risk her life. He couldn't lose her. The German soldier grinned, a cruel, triumphant expression on his face.
Good choice, he said.
He turned to Simone, his eyes narrowing. You, he said, his voice filled with disgust. You betrayed us. You deserve to die. He raised his pistol, aiming it at Simone's head. But before he could fire, a voice rang out from the shadows. Drop your weapon or I'll shoot. From the shadows, a figure emerged. A woman. A nurse. dressed all in white. "You," Simone whispered, relief flooding her face. "Sing, Nightingale," the woman ordered to Simone. "Sing your song." Simone took a breath, then, in a surprisingly clear voice, sang out a note. A high, clear, sustained note. The Germans looked confused. They had never heard of the rumored Nightingale of Amiens, the intelligence operative, the saboteur. Then the building began to shake. The note was having its effect. The woman had calculated perfectly. The note was creating a vibration, destabilizing the structure. Dust and small stones fell. The shelves rattled, toppling with a crash. Chaos. The Germans panicked, scrambling to escape the collapsing building. Isabel and Samuel used the distraction, ducking low and running toward the back of the area, to the small hidden door. They were safe. For the moment. "Who are you?" Isabel asked her savior. "I'm the one they whisper about."
"The one they fear," she said.
"I'm the Nightingale." And she was gone, as quickly as she had appeared, leaving Isabel and Samuel in the ruins of the apothecary, with Simone and the echoes of a song that had saved their lives. Chapter 17. Beneath a Sky of Fire. The revelation of the Nightingale, a shadowy figure operating within the hospital, added another layer of intrigue and danger to their already precarious situation. Isabel and Samuel were left with more questions than answers. Who was this mysterious woman? What was her connection to Simone? And what was her ultimate goal? They managed to get Simone to a safe house, a hidden location known only to a select few within military intelligence. She was still shaken, but she was alive, and she was finally willing to cooperate fully, sharing everything she knew about the German spy network. Simone's information proved invaluable, confirming Samuel's suspicions about a planned offensive targeting the supply depot near Amiens. She revealed the date, the time, and the specific route the German forces intended to take. Armed with this knowledge, Samuel and a small team of military intelligence officers devised a plan to intercept the attack and turn the tables on the enemy. It was a risky operation, fraught with danger, but they had no choice. The lives of countless soldiers, the fate of the Allied war effort, hung in the balance. Isabel, meanwhile, was left to grapple with her own anxieties and fears. She knew that Samuel was walking into the heart of danger, that he might not come back. The thought was unbearable, a constant ache in her heart. She tried to focus on her work at the hospital, finding solace in the routine and the tangible impact she had on the lives of the wounded. But every distant explosion, every ambulance arriving with its cargo of broken bodies, sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She found herself drawn to the ruined chapel, the place where she and Samuel had exchanged their vows, the place where their love had been tested and reaffirmed. She would sit there for hours, praying for his safety, praying for a future where they could finally be together, free from the shadow of war. The day of the planned offensive dawned gray and ominous, the sky heavy with a threat of rain. Samuel left before dawn, his face pale but resolute, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and love. He kissed her goodbye, a long, tender kiss that conveyed all the emotions he couldn't express in words. "I'll be back," he whispered. "I promise." She clung to him, her heart aching with fear and love. "Be careful," she whispered back. "Please be careful." He smiled, a fragile, fleeting smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I will," he said. "I have something to come back to." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom. Isabel watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes filled with tears. The hours that followed were an agonizing wait. Isabel tried to keep busy, tending to the wounded, assisting the other nurses, but her mind was elsewhere, with Samuel, in the heart of the battle. The sound of artillery fire grew louder, closer, the ground shaking with the force of the explosions. The hospital became a scene of controlled chaos as casualties began to arrive, their bodies broken and bloodied, their faces etched with pain and terror. Isabel worked tirelessly, her hands moving with a practiced grace that belied the turmoil churning within her. She assessed injuries, applied tourniquets, administered morphine, her focus laser-sharp, her emotions suppressed. But every time a new ambulance arrived, her heart leaped into her throat, her eyes scanning the faces of the wounded, searching for him. As the day wore on, the fighting intensified. The sky turned a fiery red, the air thick with smoke and the stench of gunpowder. The hospital was overwhelmed, the wards overflowing with casualties, the corridors filled with the moans of the injured and the cries of the dying. Isabel felt a sense of despair, a growing fear that she would never see Samuel again. She had lost so much already. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him too. Then, as dusk began to settle, a hush fell over the battlefield. The artillery fire ceased. The sounds of fighting faded away. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the occasional crackle of flames and the distant cries of the wounded. The battle was over. But who had won? And at what cost? Isabel waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the hospital. She waited for news, for any sign of Samuel, for any indication that he was still alive. Finally, as darkness enveloped the landscape, a figure emerged from the gloom. It was a soldier, his uniform torn and bloodstained, his face covered in grime, but his eyes were familiar. It was Samuel. She rushed to him, her heart overflowing with relief and joy. She threw her arms around him, holding him tight, burying her face in his chest. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're alive." He held her close, his body trembling with exhaustion and something else. Something that made her heart skip a beat. "I told you," he whispered back, his voice hoarse. "I told you I'd come back." He pulled away slightly, looking at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and pain. "Isabel," he said, his voice strained. "There's something you need to know." Her heart sank. Something was wrong. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he held himself, in the tremor in his voice. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's happened?" He took a deep breath, his gaze locking with hers. The offensive," he said. We stopped it. But there were casualties. Heavy casualties. He paused, his eyes filling with tears. "And Simone, she didn't survive." Simone. The news hit Isabel like a physical blow. Despite the doubts, the suspicions, she had hoped that Simone was innocent, that she had been a victim, not a collaborator. But she knew the cost of war. Samuel looked down, at his hands, his voice a whisper. "I couldn't save her." Isabel reached out and took his hands in hers. "You did everything you could," she said, then pulled him close. Beneath a sky that had been on fire, they held each other. They had survived, but the cost of survival, the weight of loss, would forever be a part of their lives. The war was not over, but their love, their commitment, remained a beacon of hope amidst the ruins. Chapter 18. The Threads of Fate. The aftermath of the battle brought a somber atmosphere to the hospital. The victory over the German offensive was overshadowed by the heavy casualties, the loss of life, and the lingering sense of vulnerability. Simone's death, though she had been a suspected collaborator, cast a pall over Isabel and Samuel, a reminder of the complex moral ambiguities of war. Samuel, despite his physical and emotional exhaustion, was hailed as a hero. His bravery and strategic acumen had been instrumental in thwarting the German attack, saving countless lives. He received a commendation, a promotion, and the respect of his superiors and peers. But the accolades meant little to him. He was haunted by the faces of the fallen, by the knowledge that he couldn't save everyone, by the guilt that gnawed at his conscience. He withdrew into himself, his usual warmth and humor replaced by a brooding silence. Isabel understood his pain, his grief. She had seen it before, in the eyes of countless soldiers, the psychological scars of war that often ran deeper than any physical wound. She tried to reach him, to offer comfort, to reassure him that he had done everything he could, but he remained distant, lost in his own private torment. She focused on her work at the hospital, finding solace in the routine and the tangible impact she had on the lives of the wounded. But even there, she couldn't escape the shadow of war, the constant reminder of the fragility of life, the ever-present threat of loss. One evening, as she was tending to a young soldier with a severe leg wound, she noticed a small, familiar object tucked beneath his pillow. It was a coin, identical to the ones Samuel had carried, the ones that had become a symbol of their love and their connection. Her heart skipped a beat. Where had this soldier gotten the coin? Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more? "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The soldier, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion, looked at her blankly. I don't know," he mumbled. "It was given to me. By a woman." A woman? The nightingale? Could it be? What woman? Isabel pressed, her voice urgent. "Describe her." The soldier struggled to recall, his memory fragmented by trauma and medication.
"She was a nurse," he said.
But different. She moved like a shadow. She had a voice like music. A voice like music. The nightingale's song. It had to be her. "Did she say anything?" Isabel asked. "Did she give you a message?" The soldier hesitated, his brow furrowed in concentration. She said, "Tell the lieutenant the threads are unraveling." The threads are unraveling. The words sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. What did they mean? Was it a warning? A clue? She knew she had to tell Samuel. She found him in their room, sitting by the window, staring out at the darkness. He looked pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Samuel," she said, her voice soft. I need to tell you something." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" he asked. She told him about the soldier, the coin, the nightingale's message. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing, his mind racing. "The threads are unraveling," he repeated, his voice low. "What does it mean?" They spent the next few hours discussing the message, trying to decipher its meaning. They considered every possibility, every angle, every connection. Finally, Samuel had a breakthrough. "The threads," he said. "They refer to the spy network. Du Bois network. It's not over. It's still active. And it's unraveling." He explained that the nightingale, whoever she was clearly working against the German spies. She was trying to expose them, to dismantle their network. And she was using Samuel, using them, to do it.
"She's guiding us," he said.
"She's leading us to the truth." But who was she? And why was she helping them? They decided to follow the nightingale's lead, to investigate the remaining threads of the spy network, to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. They started by revisiting the locations on Du Bois' map of memories, searching for any clues, any connections they might have missed. They discovered hidden messages, secret compartments, and a list of names. The names were different from the ones they had found before. These were new names, people they hadn't suspected, people who were still operating within the hospital, within the military, within the government. The spy network was far more extensive, far more deeply rooted than they had ever imagined. It reached into every corner of society, a web of deception and betrayal that threatened to undermine the entire Allied war effort. They knew they had to act quickly. They had to expose the remaining spies, to bring them to justice, to stop them before they could do any more damage. But as they delved deeper into the investigation, they realized that they were walking into a trap, a carefully orchestrated plan designed to silence them forever. The threads of fate, it seemed, were drawing them into a deadly game, a final confrontation with an enemy that was far more powerful, far more ruthless than they had ever imagined. And the nightingale, their mysterious ally, was leading them straight into the heart of darkness. Chapter 19. Scars of Yesterday, Love of Tomorrow. The list of names discovered through the nightingale's clues led Samuel and Isabel down a treacherous path, each name a potential enemy, each connection a step closer to a hidden truth. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, now felt like a den of vipers, every corridor and ward shadowed by suspicion. They worked in secret, sharing their findings only with a trusted few within military intelligence. The investigation was delicate, requiring a careful balance of stealth and precision. One wrong move, one misplaced word, could alert the spies and put their lives in immediate danger. As they delved deeper, They uncovered a pattern, a common thread that linked the names on the list. Many of the individuals were connected to a pre-war organization, a clandestine society known as the Serpent Circle. This group, comprised of wealthy industrialists, influential politicians, and disgruntled military officers, had long harbored ambitions of undermining the British government and forging an alliance with Germany. The war had provided them with the perfect opportunity to achieve their goals. They had infiltrated key positions within the military and government, using their influence to sabotage the war effort, leak sensitive information, and sow discord among the Allied forces. Samuel realized that Du Bois had been just a pawn in a much larger game, a small cog in a vast, intricate machine of treachery. The true masterminds were still at large, pulling the strings from the shadows, orchestrating a campaign of sabotage and deception that threatened to bring the Allied forces to their knees. One name on the list stood out: Lord Ashworth, a prominent member of Parliament, a respected philanthropist, and a close advisor to the Prime Minister. It seemed impossible, unthinkable, that such a man could be involved in such a conspiracy. But the evidence was mounting, pointing to Ashworth as the leader of the Serpent Circle, the architect of the spy network. Samuel knew that exposing Ashworth would be incredibly dangerous. The man had powerful allies, vast resources, and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He would stop at nothing to protect himself and his organization. But Samuel was determined to bring him down. He had come too far, lost too much, to turn back now. He had a duty to his country, to his fallen comrades, and to Isabel, to see this through to the end. He devised a plan, a daring and risky operation to gather irrefutable evidence of Ashworth's treachery. He would infiltrate a secret meeting of the Serpent Circle, posing as a disgruntled officer seeking to join their ranks. Isabel was terrified for him. She knew the risks were immense, the chances of success slim. She pleaded with him to reconsider, to let military intelligence handle it, but he was adamant. He had to do this, for himself, for his country, for their future. He kissed her goodbye, a long, passionate kiss that conveyed all the love and fear he couldn't express in words. "I'll be back," he promised, his voice filled with a determination that belied the tremor in his hands. "I promise." She clung to him, her heart aching with a premonition of loss. "Be careful," she whispered. "Please be careful." He smiled, a bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I will," he said. "I have something to come back to." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Isabel watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes filled with tears. The hours that followed were an agonizing wait. Isabel tried to keep busy, tending to the wounded, assisting the other nurses, but her mind was elsewhere, with Samuel, in the heart of danger. She found herself drawn to the ruined chapel, the place where they had exchanged their vows, the place where their love had been tested and reaffirmed. She sat there, praying for his safety, praying for a miracle. As dawn approached, she heard a commotion outside the hospital. She rushed out, her heart leaping with hope and fear. A group of soldiers were carrying a stretcher, bearing a body covered in a blood-stained sheet. Isabel's heart sank. She just knew it was Samuel. She ran towards the stretcher, her legs trembling, her breath catching in her throat. She reached the soldiers, pushing her way through the crowd. She pulled back the sheet, revealing the face of the fallen soldier. It wasn't Samuel. Relief washed over her, a wave of overwhelming gratitude that left her weak and trembling. But the relief was short-lived. Where was Samuel? Was he still alive? Was he captured? Was he worse? Then she saw him. He was walking towards her, his uniform torn and dirty, his face bruised and bloodied, but his eyes were shining with triumph. He had done it. He had exposed Ashworth and the Serpent Circle. He had survived. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, holding him tight, burying her face in his chest. She didn't care about the blood, the dirt, the grime. She didn't care about anything except the fact that he was alive, that he was back, that he was safe. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "It's finally over." They held each other, their bodies trembling with relief and love, their tears mingling with the sweat and grime of battle. The scars of yesterday were still fresh, the wounds still raw, but the love of tomorrow, the promise of a future free from the shadows of war, shone brightly on the horizon. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged, battered but not broken, their love a beacon of hope in a world desperately in need of healing. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of War. The exposure of Lord Ashworth and the Serpent's Circle sent shockwaves through the British government and military. The ensuing investigation revealed a vast network of corruption and treachery that reached the highest echelons of power. Many prominent figures were arrested, tried, and convicted of treason, their reputations shattered, their lives ruined. The war effort, though still far from over, received a much-needed boost. The dismantling of the spy network significantly hampered German intelligence gathering, giving the Allied forces a crucial advantage on the battlefield. Samuel, hailed as a hero once again, was offered a permanent position within military intelligence. But he declined. He had seen enough of war, of death, of deception. He wanted a different life, a life of peace, a life with Isabel. He resigned his commission, his military career officially over. He was a civilian now, free to pursue his own path, to build a future with the woman he loved. Isabel, too, was ready for a change. The constant stress and emotional toll of nursing in a war zone had taken its toll. She longed for a quieter life, a life of normalcy, a life where she could heal not just bodies, but also souls. They decided to leave Amiens, to leave France, to return to England, to Samuel's childhood home in Devon, the place he had so often described to her, the place where he dreamed of building a life together. They traveled by train and ferry, leaving behind the ravaged landscape of war, the memories of pain and loss, the echoes of gunfire and explosions. As they crossed the English Channel, the skies cleared, the sun broke through the clouds, and a sense of hope, of renewal, filled their hearts. They arrived in Devon on a crisp autumn day, the rolling hills bathed in golden sunlight, the air fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the smoke and grime of war-torn France. Samuel's family home was a charming cottage, nestled in a small village, surrounded by fields and forests, a picture of idyllic tranquility. They settled into a quiet routine, Samuel tending to the small farm, Isabel finding work at the local village clinic. They spent their evenings by the fireplace, reading, talking, simply enjoying each other's company, savoring the peace and quiet that had been so elusive during the war. They healed, slowly but surely, the physical and emotional scars of war gradually fading, replaced by a sense of contentment, of gratitude, of profound love. They had survived the darkness, they had overcome the obstacles, and they had emerged stronger, more resilient, their bond unbreakable. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Samuel turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with love and tenderness. "Isabel," he said, his voice soft and earnest. I know we've been through so much. I know the war, it changed us. But it also brought us together. It made us who we are." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. I can't imagine my life without you," he said. "You're my everything. My love, my best friend, my soulmate." Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, tears of joy, of gratitude, of overwhelming love. She had found her happiness, her peace, in the arms of this man, this wounded warrior who had become her whole world. "I love you, Samuel," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you more than words can say." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken vows, their enduring commitment, their unwavering love. The reckoning of war had been brutal, a crucible that had tested their strength, their resilience, their faith. But it had also forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel, a love that had conquered darkness, a hope that had blossomed amidst the ruins. They had found their future, their forever, in each other's arms, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of light in a world desperately in need of healing. The war was over for them, and their new life, a life of peace, of love, of happiness, was just beginning. Epilogue. Years passed, turning autumns into winters, winters into springs, springs into the long, golden summers of Devon. The cottage, once filled with the quiet echoes of Samuel's solitary past, now resonated with the laughter of children, the warmth of a family built on the foundations of a love forged in war. Isabel and Samuel had 3 children, a daughter, Clara, with her mother's dark, intelligent eyes and her father's quiet determination, a son, Thomas, named for the young soldier Isabel had tended in the cathedral, a boy with Samuel's gentle smile and Isabel's compassionate heart, and a second son, William, a mischievous, adventurous spirit who inherited both his parents' resilience and their unwavering zest for life. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, never completely faded. Samuel still carried the marks of his injuries, a constant reminder of the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made. Isabel sometimes woke in the night, her heart pounding, haunted by the faces of the wounded, the echoes of their cries. But they had learned to live with the shadows, to embrace the light, to cherish the moments of joy and peace that life offered. They had built a sanctuary, a haven of love and laughter, where the horrors of the past could be kept at bay, where the future could be nurtured and cherished. Clara, the eldest, developed a keen interest in medicine, inspired by her mother's stories of the war, of the lives she had saved, the suffering she had eased. She dreamed of becoming a doctor, of following in Isabel's footsteps, of making a difference in the world. Thomas, the gentle soul, found solace in nature, spending hours exploring the fields and forests surrounding their home, discovering the beauty and tranquility of the natural world. He had a gift for understanding animals, a quiet empathy that mirrored his father's compassion. William, the adventurer, was always seeking new challenges, new experiences. He inherited his parents' courage and their unwavering spirit, a thirst for life that propelled him forward, always searching, always exploring. Isabel continued her work at the village clinic, becoming a beloved figure in the community, known for her kindness, her skill, and her unwavering dedication to her patients. She never forgot the lessons she had learned during the war, the importance of compassion, of empathy, of human connection. Samuel, though he had left the world of intelligence behind, found new purpose in farming, in nurturing the land, in providing for his family. He found peace in the simple rhythms of nature, in the cycle of planting and harvesting, in the quiet satisfaction of a hard day's work. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching their children play in the garden, Samuel reached out and took Isabel's hand. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that had deepened with time, a gratitude that transcended words. "Remember the coin?" he asked, his voice soft, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Isabel nodded, her heart filled with a bittersweet nostalgia.
The coin.
The symbol of their love, their connection, their journey through darkness and into light. "I still have them," she said. "Both of them." She reached into a small wooden box, the same box that had once held the secrets of Du Bois' spy network, now repurposed to hold their most precious treasures. She pulled out the 2 coins, the smooth, worn metal glinting in the fading sunlight. Samuel took one of the coins, turning it over and over in his hand. He traced the familiar inscription, the scratch across the surface, the etched message that had once been a beacon of hope in a world of despair. "I'm coming back." He looked at Isabel, his eyes filled with a love that had endured the trials of war, the passage of time, the challenges of life. "And I did," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I came back to you." She smiled, tears welling up in her eyes, tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had conquered all. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, tender kiss that spoke volumes, a kiss that sealed their enduring bond, their unwavering commitment, their forever love. The children's laughter echoed through the garden, a symphony of happiness, a testament to the life they had built together, a legacy of hope born from the ashes of war. The scars remained, but they were a part of their story, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the obstacles they had overcome, the love that had sustained them through it all. They had found their peace, their happiness, their forever, in the quiet beauty of Devon, in the warmth of their family, in the enduring power of their love. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over their world, they knew that they had, indeed, found their happily ever after, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love born in the heart of war. The end.